Of the 12 men who once ate at the same table as Jesus of Nazareth, tradition says only one of them ever died quietly, alone, in his own bed. The other 11, church memory insists, met ends that would help build the very faith they carried across the ancient world, and which single man survived, we will only reveal at the very end. After their teacher's death and sudden disappearance from the tomb, the 11 remaining men and a 12th chosen soon after by the drawing of lots scattered out from Jerusalem across the entire Roman world, into lands most of them had never once set foot in, carrying nothing but a story and the memory of an empty tomb. They carried a message that most empires of the ancient world would have tried, sooner or later, to quietly crush before it could spread any further. The Book of Acts, the earliest surviving record we have, names only one of their deaths directly, or a single, brutal sentence about a king who wanted to please a crowd. For every other apostle, we are left with something rarer than scripture and older than legend, the living memory of local churches, passed down for generations, told at gravesides and feast days, long before anyone ever wrote a single word of it into a book. That kind of memory is not proof in the way a modern court of law would demand it, but it is not nothing, either. It is what an entire faith, across dozens of separate cultures, still remembers about the men who first built it. Start with the one Jesus himself renamed the Rock. Simon, called Peter, a rough Galilean fisherman who denied even knowing his teacher 3 times in a single night. Tradition says Peter carried that private memory of failure all the way to Rome, the capital of the very empire that would, some 3 decades later, be the one to finally kill him, a fisherman from a backwater province standing, at the end, in the very heart of the world that ruled his people. Under the Emperor Nero, after a great fire tore through the city and rumors spread that he himself had ordered it, Christians became a convenient scapegoat to blame instead. Peter, church tradition holds, was arrested soon after and sentenced to the cross. He asked, tradition says, to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy of dying in the very same way as the man he had once denied. Beneath a hill in Rome called the Vatican, archaeologists have since uncovered an ancient tomb and graffiti calling on Peter by name, centuries before any basilica ever stood above it. One fisherman's failure of nerve on a single terrible night became, in the end, the foundation stone of a faith that would outlive the empire that executed him. Peter's own brother, Andrew, had introduced him to Jesus in the very first place, long before any of the 12 had any idea what that meeting would eventually cost them. Andrew's own road led not to Rome, but north, into Greece, tradition says, preaching along coasts his brother would never see. In the city of Patmos, tradition holds, Andrew was condemned to death for turning a Roman governor's own wife, and eventually his brother too, toward this strange new Eastern faith spreading quietly through the province, town by town, household by household. He was bound, not nailed, to a cross shaped like the letter X so that his death would come slowly, and his preaching, tradition insists, would not stop until the very last breath. That shape still carries his name today, stitched into national flags and carved into old chapel doors across the very coasts he once walked. 2 brothers, called away on the very same ordinary morning from the very same fishing nets on the very same lake, one crucified upright in distant Rome, the other crucified sideways on a windswept Greek clifftop. But the very first apostle to die was not Peter at all, and this one is not a matter of legend. It is written plainly, a simple fact, in the Book of Acts. James, the son of Zebedee and older brother of John, had once asked Jesus, together with his brother, for a seat of honor beside him in his coming glory, an ambitious, all too human request, not knowing at the time what that closeness would eventually cost him. Instead, King Herod Agrippa, eager to please the religious leaders of Jerusalem, had him seized without warning and put to the sword. It is the only apostolic death the Book of Acts records as plain, dated fact, rather than something remembered by later generations of believers. It was also the fastest death of all 12, and the only one the earliest Christians never had to rely on memory alone to prove had happened. Furthest from home of all the 12 apostles traveled Thomas, the one remembered forever for doubting his teacher's resurrection, refusing to believe it, until he could touch the wounds with his own hands. Tradition carries him east, past Persia entirely, past kingdoms most of the other apostles never even heard named, all the way to the Malabar coast of India, where communities still trace their faith back to his own arrival. There, church tradition says, he was struck down with a spear on a hill just outside the city of Mylapore, while he was at prayer. For 2,000 years since, the community he is said to have founded has kept his name alive in a land no other apostle is remembered to have ever reached. A doubter who once demanded physical proof became, tradition insists, the very apostle who carried the faith furthest of all from where it first began. Closer to home, in the rugged mountains north of Judea, Bartholomew are barely mentioned at all in the Gospels themselves, appearing under another name entirely. In some accounts is remembered for a harder fate still than almost any of his 11 companions. Tradition holds he was flayed and beheaded in Armenia after converting a local king, a death so tied to his memory that later artists painted him carrying his own skin. Armenia would go on, within a few short generations, to become the very first nation on earth to adopt Christianity as its own official faith. One brutal death, tradition insists, planted a faith that would outlast every single king who ever tried to uproot it from that mountain soil. Philip, another of the 12, is remembered in the Gospels for a far simpler and quieter role, the one who found and brought his skeptical friend Nathanael to come and meet Jesus for himself, with nothing more persuasive to offer than 3 plain words, "Come and see." Later tradition sends him to Hierapolis in Asia Minor, a city devoted to a local serpent cult, where he is said to have been crucified, or in some accounts stoned, after confronting that worship head-on before its own priests and crowds. In 2011, archaeologists excavating that very same city uncovered what they now believe is Philip's actual tomb, nearly 2,000 years after his recorded death. The man who once simply said "come and see" became, 20 centuries later, something excavators themselves finally came to see with their own eyes. Matthew, once a tax collector working for the occupying Roman government, a profession his own people deeply despised as outright betrayal, is remembered by wildly different traditions in wildly different lands. Some traditions place his death in Ethiopia, others in Persia or even further east still others naming a different city entirely to accounts written centuries apart, in lands that likely never once compared notes, agreeing only that his end was violent. What every single version agrees on is this: the man once mocked for collecting Roman taxes died carrying a message no empire could ever fully silence. 3 more of the 12 left behind even less of a written record than the others. James, son of Alphaeus, is barely more than a name today, remembered by some traditions as stoned to death in Jerusalem itself. Simon, called the Zealot for the fierce nationalist movement he once belonged to before ever meeting Jesus, is remembered in different traditions as martyred in Persia, or in distant Britain, or nowhere certain at all. Jude, also called Thaddeus, is remembered alongside Simon in the very oldest traditions, the 2 said to have died together, far from Jerusalem, spreading a message neither would live to see take root. 3 names, 3 uncertain endings, and yet all 3 are still honored today in churches on continents none of these men, in their own lifetimes, could ever have imagined even existed. There is a 13th name in this story that almost nobody ever remembers at all: Matthias, a follower of Jesus from the very beginning who had never been counted among the original 12, chosen afterward by the drawing of lots to replace the apostle who had betrayed Jesus and then taken his own life. Chosen simply to fill an empty, disgraced seat, Matthias is remembered by tradition as preaching in distant lands before being stoned, or in some accounts beheaded, for his stubborn faith. The man history nearly forgot to name even once still, in the end, paid exactly the same price as the 11 whose names everyone still remembers today. So count it up, 10 men, by every surviving tradition, died as martyrs by cross, by sword, by stone, in a dozen different lands. 1 is remembered by scripture alone. 2 names remain. One of those 2 we have already named, James, beheaded on Herod's order, the one death the Book of Acts records as certain fact rather than later church memory. The very last name belongs to James's own younger brother, the youngest of the 12 when they were first called from their nets, and the only one tradition insists never died a violent death of any kind at all. John, son of Zebedee and younger brother of the already martyred James, is remembered as the disciple Jesus loved most of all, the only one of the 12 said to have stood at the very foot of the cross. Roman authorities, tradition says, tried more than once to kill him anyway, boiling oil, deadly poison, and each time, the old stories insist, he simply survived without harm. Unable to kill him by any ordinary means, the Emperor Domitian is said to have exiled the aging apostle instead, sentencing him to hard labor in the island's quarries, on a small, dry, rocky island off the coast of Asia Minor called Patmos. In a cave on that lonely island, alone, old, and far from everyone he had ever known, John is said to have received the strangest vision in the entire New Testament. He wrote of seals broken open one by one, of riders and beasts, and a city built of light, visions later copied by hand onto fragile papyrus and carried across the ancient world. By the time John finally died, tradition places him not on a cross and not by any blade, but quietly, in the city of Ephesus, said to be nearly 100 years old. So now, the answer held back since the very first scene of this film, of the 12 who once sat at that last table, only John is remembered to have died of quiet old age. Every other name on that long list, Peter, Andrew, James, Thomas, Bartholomew, Philip, Matthew, James the Lesser, Simon, Jude, and Matthias, is remembered by history, in one tradition or another, as having paid for the message with his own life, far from the shores where he first learned it. Historians will always caution that most of these accounts come from later tradition, not courtroom-grade evidence written decades or even centuries afterward, by authors with their own agendas, in places we cannot always independently verify today. But the pattern itself is very hard to simply explain away. 11 men, scattered to 11 different corners of the known world, each independently remembered as dying for the exact same claim. Not one of the 12, by any surviving account or tradition anywhere, is ever remembered to have recanted simply to save his own life or a detail that sets their story apart. People will lie, historians will readily note, for money, for power, or out of simple fear, but a dozen separate cultures, most with no way of ever comparing notes with one another, rarely preserve dying traditions this consistent purely by accident. Whatever any viewer ultimately makes of the miracles woven through their story, the deaths themselves left behind something that no empire on earth could ever quite erase. Within only 3 centuries, the faith carried by 12 scattered, mostly murdered men had already outlasted the very empire that had personally killed most of them. Fisherman, a despised tax collector, a doubter, a zealot, and a man chosen almost as an afterthought, ordinary names that ancient churches on 4 continents still refuse to let go. In Rome, pilgrims still descend beneath the great basilica, past ancient walls and older graves layered one above another, to stand near the bones tradition calls Peter's own, exactly where archaeologists found that ancient graffiti bearing his name. On the Malabar coast of India, congregations tracing their line back to Thomas still gather in stone churches built on ground his own followers are said to have first blessed, in a community that has kept its own distinct identity for 2,000 unbroken years. On Patmos, visitors still climb to the same rocky cave, still narrow and dim, where an old exile is remembered to have seen a vision meant to outlast every empire on earth. 12 ordinary men, chosen from fishing boats and tax booths and a fierce rebel movement, ended up scattered across the entire known world, from Britain to India to the edge of the Sahara, and stayed there, in memory, for 2,000 years. 10 crosses, 1 sword, and 1 lonely cave on a forgotten island. This is what remains of the 12 men who once simply followed a carpenter's son out of Galilee.